In a perfect Cotswolds manner, during a quiet family dinner, an old colonel suddenly grabs his wife's hand so tight they can't even pry it loose after he dies. His last whispered word? "My dear." But he wasn't looking at his wife. He was staring at the mild vicar across the table, his secret son from India, the one he never acknowledged. Poison in the brandy, a frozen death grip, a hidden scar, and one quiet old lady knitting in the corner who saw the truth before anyone else. Who really killed him? The beautiful widow? The broke nephew? Or the son who waited 20 years for a single glance of recognition? Miss Marple knows, and the motive will break your heart. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Willowmere Manor. The Cotswolds in late autumn wore its most beguiling aspect. Rolling hills draped in a soft golden haze, high hedgerows still clinging to the last crimson leaves, and every village lane winding like a ribbon through meadows where sheep grazed in placid indifference. Willowmere, one of those hidden valleys that seem almost too perfect to be real, lay cradled between gentle slopes of ancient pasture. Its cottages, built of the famous honey-colored Cotswold stone, glowed warmly even under a lowering sky, their roofs of thick, mossy thatch or slate catching the fleeting sun. Roses and wisteria, though past their prime, still trailed over doorways, and the little stone bridge spanning the clear brook bore the patina of centuries. At the head of the valley rose Willowmere Manor, a graceful Georgian house of pale limestone, its symmetrical facade pierced by tall sash windows that reflected the sky like mirrors. Tall chimneys flanked the hipped roof, and the entrance was framed by a pedimented portico supported on slender columns. Terraced gardens descended in ordered steps toward a lake, where water lilies floated, their white blooms ghostly in the twilight. Box hedges clipped into perfect spheres flanked gravel paths, and beyond the lawns stretched parkland dotted with ancient oaks, their branches spreading like protective arms. Colonel Reginald Hargrove, late of His Majesty's Indian Army, had made the manor his retirement seat some 15 years earlier. A man of military bearing, straight-backed, mustache waxed to sharp points, voice inclined to command, he had inherited the place unexpectedly from a childless cousin, and promptly set about restoring its faded splendor. His wife, Lydia, 20 years his junior, presided over the household with an elegance that bordered on frost. Tall, dark-haired, her features classically regular, she moved through the rooms as though every gesture had been rehearsed before a mirror. Their guests for the weekend were few, but carefully chosen. First to arrive was Arthur Hargrove, the colonel's nephew, a young man of 30 with an artist's disheveled charm, hair too long, tie askew, hands stained with clay from his sculpting. He came in a battered motor car, bringing with him an air of perpetual optimism and the faint scent of turpentine. His debts were whispered about in certain London circles, yet his uncle tolerated him, perhaps because Arthur's mother had been the colonel's favorite sister. Reverend Theodore Ellis followed in a modest bicycle, his clerical collar gleaming white against sober black. A quiet, scholarly man in his late 40s, he had ministered to the parish for a dozen years, his sermons noted for their mild erudition rather than fire. He carried a small parcel of books as a gift, and his handshake was firm but brief. Last came Miss Emily Croft, the colonel's elder sister by 3 years, a spare, upright woman who favored tweed skirts and sensible shoes. She arrived by train and local taxi, her luggage consisting of a single worn valise and a tin of pressed flowers she had collected on the journey. Miss Croft spoke little of her own life, preferring to recall, in exhaustive detail, the glories of their childhood summers at the manor, before the world had changed so irrevocably. The invitations had been issued with military precision. A weekend of rest, good food, and conversation. Nothing more. Yet as the guests gathered in the drawing-room before dinner, its walls paneled in oak, a fire crackling in the Adam fireplace, long windows giving onto the darkening lake, there hung in the air that subtle tension which attends any gathering where old ties are renewed under one roof. Miss Jane Marple was not among the invited. She had come to Willowmere only the week before, to stay with a distant cousin in a modest stone cottage on the village edge. From her garden bench, where she sat with a cup of tea and her knitting, she had observed the arrivals. The flash of headlights on the drive, the murmur of voices, the occasional laugh that carried too far on the still evening air. She watched particularly as Lydia Hargrove stood at the top of the steps to greet her guests, her smile fixed and gracious. "So such a charming spot," Miss Marple murmured to the thrush pecking at crumbs on the path. And yet, charm, like beauty, so often conceals something quite different underneath. The dinner gong sounded across the valley, a deep, resonant note that seemed to vibrate through the very stone of the manor. Inside, candles were lit, silver gleamed, and the table was set with the Colonel's best china. The weekend had begun. No one yet suspected that before it ended, one of them would die, clutching another's hand in a final, desperate grasp, while the golden Cotswolds slept peacefully beyond the windows. Chapter 2. The Dinner and the Clutch. The dining room of Willowmere Manor was a study in restrained elegance, the sort of room that seemed to have been waiting patiently for just such an evening. Long windows draped in heavy damask overlooked the lake, where the last light of day had faded into a soft indigo, broken only by the occasional silver ripple from a passing swan. A crystal chandelier hung above the table, its prisms catching the candle flames and scattering them like tiny stars across polished mahogany. The table itself was set with precision. White linen cloth starched to crispness, silver cutlery gleaming, and china of a delicate pattern, pale blue borders with tiny gilt flowers that had belonged to the Colonel's grandmother. Colonel Reginald Hargrove took his place at the head, his back as straight as a rifle barrel. To his right sat Lydia, composed and cool, in a gown of midnight silk that set off the pallor of her skin and the darkness of her hair. Arthur occupied the seat opposite her, fidgeting slightly with his napkin, his artist's hands restless even in repose. Reverend Ellis was placed to the Colonel's left, his clerical collar a stark white against the black of his suit, while Miss Emily Croft sat beside him, her tweed evening dress practical rather than fashionable, a small brooch of pressed flowers pinned at her throat. The servants, two local girls and an elderly butler who had served the family for decades, moved with quiet efficiency, serving soup from a tureen of silver chased with vines. It was a clear consommé, light and golden, flavored with a hint of sherry. Conversation began in the usual polite way, the sort that fills the air without saying very much. "Delightful soup, Reginald," said Miss Croft, spooning it delicately. "Reminds me of the consommé we used to have at Aunt Beatrice's in the old days. She always insisted on skimming it herself." The Colonel gave a short nod, the corners of his mustache twitching. One must maintain standards, Emily. Standards are what separate civilization from chaos. Arthur laughed lightly, though there was an edge to it. Uncle, you make it sound as though the fate of the empire rests on a well-skimmed broth. Perhaps it does, replied the colonel. Discipline in small things leads to discipline in large. Wouldn't you agree, Reverend? Reverend Ellis inclined his head. The Bible speaks of stewardship in all matters, Colonel. He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much. Lydia smiled faintly, her spoon pausing midway to her lips. A comforting thought, Reverend. Though I sometimes wonder if faithfulness is always rewarded. There was a brief silence, on the sort that occurs when someone has said something just a shade too pointed. Arthur broke it by turning to Lydia. You've been quiet this evening, Aunt. Everything all right? Perfectly, she answered, merely enjoying the company. The fish course arrived, sole poached in white wine, served with a light sauce and parsley potatoes. The colonel carved portions with military exactness, passing plates along the table. As he did so, he glanced at Arthur. Any progress with that commission of yours, boy? The one for the gallery in Bath? Arthur's smile was quick, almost too quick. Coming along. The patron wants something heroic. Lions, perhaps, or a charging boar. I'm thinking of modeling it after the Parthenon friezes. Timeless, you know. Timeless costs money, the colonel observed dryly. And money, as you well know, does not grow on trees. Arthur's fork paused. Uncle, we've discussed this. Yes, we have, the colonel cut in. And the discussion is closed. Miss Croft intervened smoothly. Arthur's work has great promise, Reginald. I saw the small bronze he did last year. The one of the sleeping faun. Quite charming. Charming, repeated the colonel, is not the same as profitable. Reverend Ellis cleared his throat. Art has its own rewards, Colonel. Though I confess, I prefer the quiet beauty of a well-tended churchyard to the noise of galleries. Lydia's eyes flicked toward the vicar, a brief, unreadable glance. Beauty is often quietest when it conceals something, don't you think? The remark hung in the air like smoke. No one answered at once. The main course followed. Roast pheasant, stuffed with chestnuts, and served with bread sauce, red currant jelly, and game chips crisp as autumn leaves. The wine, a good claret, was poured generously, and the talk turned to safer ground. The village harvest festival, the new organ fund, the likelihood of frost before Christmas. Yet beneath the surface, small currents moved. Arthur drank rather more than usual, his laughter a little forced. Miss Croft kept glancing at her brother, as though measuring something in his face. Reverend Ellis spoke seldom, but when he did, his words were careful, almost weighed. Lydia ate sparingly, her movements graceful but controlled, as though she were conserving energy for some unseen effort. Dessert was brought in, poached pears in a brandy sauce, the fruit tender and glistening, the sauce rich and amber. Coffee followed, strong and black, in small porcelain cups, and the colonel pushed back his chair slightly, a signal that the meal was drawing to its close. He lifted his glass. A toast, he said, to family and friends, to old ties that bind us, and new beginnings that await. The others raised their glasses. To family and friends, they echoed. As they drank, the colonel set his glass down and reached across the table toward Lydia. His hand closed over hers, firm, almost possessive. My dear, he said softly, his voice lower than before. Lydia looked at him, her expression unchanging. Then something altered in the colonel's face, a flicker of surprise, followed by pain. His fingers tightened around hers, knuckles whitening. He tried to speak, but only a gasp emerged. His body jerked once, violently, and he slumped sideways in his chair, head lolling toward Lydia's shoulder. How his hand remained locked around hers, rigid in death. For a moment, the room was utterly still. Then Lydia screamed, a short, sharp sound that shattered the silence. She tugged at her hand, but the colonel's grip held fast, as though welded there by some final act of will. Arthur leapt to his feet, knocking over his chair with a crash. "Uncle! Good God!" Reverend Ellis rose more slowly, his face ashen. He moved to the colonel's side, fingers seeking a pulse at the neck. "He's gone," he said quietly. "No heartbeat." Miss Croft gave a low moan and collapsed forward, her forehead striking the tablecloth with a soft thud. The butler hurried in, summoned by the scream, and stood frozen in the doorway. Lydia, still seated, stared at the hand clasped in her own. Her face was white, but dry-eyed. "Get a doctor," she said in a flat voice. "Someone fetch Dr. Hayward. Quickly." Arthur was already at the door, shouting for the motor car to be brought round. Reverend Ellis knelt beside Miss Croft, loosening her collar, murmuring reassurances. The candles flickered on, indifferent, casting long shadows across the table where the untouched brandy glass stood beside the colonel's plate. A faint, bitter scent rising from it, unnoticed in the chaos. Outside, the lake lay dark and calm, the swans gliding silently across its surface. Inside Willowmere Manor, the weekend had ended before it had properly begun, and somewhere in the quiet Cotswolds night, the first threads of suspicion began to weave themselves around the living. Chapter 3. Village Whispers and First Suspicions. Morning came to Willowmere with deceptive gentleness. A thin mist lay over the lake like muslin, softening the outlines of the willows that gave the valley its name. The honey-stone cottages along the single street caught the first pale sunlight, their windows winking as though the village itself were only just waking from a pleasant dream. Birds sang in the churchyard yews, and the brook murmured under the old bridge as though nothing at all had changed in the night. But something had changed, and the change had already begun to spread. By 7:30, the milkman's cart was making its slow rounds, the clink of bottles punctuating the quiet. At the post office, which doubled as the village shop, Mrs. Agnes Phipps, the postmistress for 32 years, stood behind the counter sorting the morning mail with hands that trembled only slightly. She had heard the news at first light from her nephew, who worked as odd job boy at the manor. Colonel Hargrove dead at dinner, sudden as a snapped thread, his hand locked round his wife's wrist till they had to prise the fingers apart with a spoon. "Heart, they're sayin'," Mrs. Phipps told the baker when he called for his newspaper. "Though I never knew the colonel to complain of his heart. Sturdy as an oak he was." The baker, Mr. Timothy Gale, set down his basket of fresh loaves. "Sudden things happen," he observed. "But holding her hand like that, right through to the end. Romantic, you might call it. Or—" He lowered his voice. "Something else." Mrs. Phipps pursed her lips. "Something else indeed. Lydia Hargrove's a cool one. Always has been. Never saw her shed a tear. Not even when the old dog died last spring." By 8 o'clock, the whispers had reached the butcher's, the greengrocer's, and in the tiny tea-room beside the church. Each retelling added a small embellishment. The scream had been blood-curdling. The vicar had fainted dead away. Arthur had tried to run and been restrained. The brandy glass had been found overturned with a suspicious residue. None of it was true, yet all of it felt plausible in the bright, clear light of a Cotswold morning. Miss Jane Marple heard the first accurate version from her cousin's spaniel, who had been let out early and returned damp from the dew. The dog's owner, Mrs. Letitia Banford, was still in her dressing gown when Miss Marple came downstairs. "Terrible business at the manor," Mrs. Banford said without preamble. "My Ellen heard it from the milkman." Colonel Hargrove dropped dead at table, clutching his wife's hand so tight they couldn't separate them without force. "Doctor, Hayward's been and gone already. Says heart failure, but you know how doctors are. They like tidy certificates." Miss Marple poured tea with a steady hand. "Very sudden," she murmured, "and yet the Colonel seemed in excellent spirits when the guests arrived yesterday. I saw him from the garden wall, standing on the steps, quite upright." Mrs. Banford nodded vigorously. "Exactly. And Lydia? Well, she's always been a mystery. Beautiful, of course, but cold. Married him for the house, some say. Others say there was more to it than that." Miss Marple sipped her tea. People do say a great many things. After breakfast, she put on her second-best hat, a neat felt with a small bunch of artificial cherries, and set out for a walk. She carried a small basket containing a pot of her own quince jelly and a jar of damson preserve, both neatly labeled in her careful hand. Condolence visits, she had always found, were best conducted with something edible. Food softened edges that words alone could not. The path to Willowmere Manor wound uphill through meadows still wet with dew. Sheep lifted their heads as she passed, regarding her with mild curiosity before returning to their grazing. At the manor gates she paused, noting the shuttered windows of the upper floor and the single motor car, Arthur's battered vehicle, still standing in the drive. The house looked oddly watchful, as though it too were waiting to see what would happen next. The door was opened by the elderly butler, Simmons, whose face had acquired an extra layer of gravity overnight. "Miss Marple," he said, "Mrs. Hargrove is not receiving many callers." "I quite understand," Miss Marple replied gently. "I have only brought a little something from my cousin's kitchen. Perhaps you would give it to her with my sympathy." Simmons hesitated, then stepped aside. "If you would wait in the morning room, madam, I will inquire." The morning room faced south, its walls papered in faded primrose, its furniture comfortable rather than grand. A low fire burned in the grate, despite the mildness of the day. Lydia Hargrove entered after a few minutes, still in black, but without the theatrical veil some widows might have chosen. Her face was pale, the skin almost translucent, yet her eyes were clear and steady. "Miss Marple," she said, "how kind of you." "Not at all, my dear." Miss Marple set the basket on a side table. "One feels so helpless at such times. A little preserve seems a very small thing, but sometimes small things are what one clings to." Lydia's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "You are very observant." They sat. Lydia poured tea from a small silver pot. Her movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic. She did not offer her hand, nor did she touch the saucer when passing it across. "I saw you in the village last week," Lydia said, "walking with your cousin's dog. You have a kind face." Miss Marple inclined her head. I have lived long enough to know that kindness is sometimes mistaken for weakness. Lydia looked at her sharply, then away. Reginald was never weak. Not until the end. There was a small silence. From the hall came the sound of footsteps. Arthur's, quick and uneven. Then the slam of a door somewhere upstairs. "He's taking it badly," Lydia said. "They all are." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Deed, death is always hardest on the living, especially when it comes without warning." Lydia set her cup down. "It came without warning to me." At that moment the door opened, and Arthur entered. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hair untidy. He stopped short at the sight of Miss Marple. "Forgive the intrusion," he said. "I didn't know we had visitors." "Miss Marple has brought preserves," Lydia told him. Arthur gave a short laugh that held no amusement. "Preserves. How very appropriate." He crossed to the window and stood looking out over the lake. "They're saying downstairs it might not have been the heart at all." Lydia's voice sharpened. "Who is saying that?" "The servants. The village. You know how it is." Miss Marple spoke quietly. "Villages have long memories and short distances. Rumors travel faster than facts." Arthur turned. "Then perhaps someone should give them facts. Uncle was perfectly well yesterday, ate everything on his plate, drank his wine, and then, suddenly—" His voice cracked. Holding her hand like that, as if he knew. "Knew what?" Lydia asked. Arthur did not answer. He stared at his aunt, then at Miss Marple, then back at the lake. A few minutes later, Reverend Ellis was announced. He carried a small bunch of white chrysanthemums from the churchyard, tied with black ribbon. His face was grave, his manner composed. "I came as soon as parish duties allowed," he said. "I thought perhaps a short prayer—" Lydia inclined her head. "Of course." The vicar set the flowers on the mantelpiece. As he did so, Miss Marple noticed that he kept his hands clasped before him, even when not in prayer, fingers interlaced, thumbs pressed together, as though holding something invisible in place. They spoke in low voices for a time, of arrangements, of the inquest that would doubtless be required, of the colonel's military honors and how they might be acknowledged. Miss Marple listened, knitting quietly in the corner armchair she had chosen. She noted the way Lydia avoided meeting anyone's eyes for more than a second, the way Arthur's foot tapped an irregular rhythm against the carpet, the way Reverend Ellis's clasped hands never quite relaxed. When she rose to leave, Lydia accompanied her to the door. "Thank you again," Lydia said, "for the preserves, and for coming." Miss Marple paused on the threshold. "One small thing, if I may. When your husband took your hand last night, did he say anything? Anything at all?" Lydia's face did not change, yet something flickered behind her eyes. "Ah," he said, "my dear." That was all. Miss Marple nodded. "Thank you." She walked back down the drive, basket empty now, the mist beginning to lift. Behind her the manor stood quiet, its windows reflecting the pale sky. Ahead lay the village street, where whispers continued to move from doorway to doorway, like a breeze through dry leaves. By lunchtime the first constable had arrived from Gloucester, a young man named Pierce, notebook in hand, hat in the other. He spoke to Simmons, to the cook, to the parlour-maid who had cleared the table. He examined the dining room, noted the position of the chairs, the empty brandy glass still on the colonel's mat. He asked questions in a low voice and wrote the answers in careful copperplate. And all the while, in cottage gardens and behind shop counters, the village watched and waited. For though the doctor had signed the certificate, And though the colonel would doubtless be buried with full military honors, something in the manner of his dying, the locked hand, the suddenness, the untouched brandy, refused to settle quietly into place. Miss Marple returned to her cousin's cottage, hung up her hat, and took out her knitting again. The pattern was a simple one, a shawl in soft gray wool. But as the needles moved, her mind turned over small details. A tremor in a hand, a glance too quickly withdrawn, a bunch of chrysanthemums tied too tightly, a single word spoken in the moment of death. People, she said to the empty room, are so very interesting when they think no one is watching. Outside, a blackbird sang from the apple tree, clear and insistent. The Cotswolds afternoon stretched golden and serene. Yet somewhere in its heart, a small, dark thread had begun to pull. Chapter 4. The County Inspector. The afternoon train from Gloucester deposited Inspector Nathaniel Craddock at the small station 2 miles beyond Willowmere, just as the sun began its slow descent behind the western hills. He was a tall man in his early 40s, lean rather than thin, with a face that seemed permanently set in an expression of polite disbelief. His overcoat was well cut, but unpretentious. His hat, a soft felt, bore the faint creases of frequent use. He carried a small leather attaché case and a notebook bound in dark green morocco. No one met him at the platform. He walked the distance to the village, noting as he went the neat hedges, the grazing sheep, the occasional cottage with smoke curling from its chimney. A peaceful place, he thought, and the sort of place where unpleasant things ought not to happen. Yet unpleasant things had happened, and the chief constable had telephoned personally that morning. Sudden death at Willowmere Manor. Colonel Hargrove, retired Indian Army. Looks like heart, but the family physician's certificate has raised eyebrows. Local man's too close to the household. Go down yourself, Craddock. Discreetly. Craddock had read the preliminary report on the train. Heart failure, certified by Dr. Hayward at 10:30 the previous night. Body removed to the mortuary chapel in Gloucester for post-mortem at the coroner's request. No immediate signs of violence. Yet the manner of death, the rigid grip on the wife's hand, the suddenness after a seemingly normal dinner, had prompted the coroner to order a full examination. The digitalis had been mentioned in a whispered aside by the pathologist's assistant. Foxglove. Common enough in gardens, easy enough to mistake for something else. He reached the manor gates shortly before 4. The drive was still marked by tire tracks from the doctor's car and the undertaker's van. Simmons opened the door before Craddock could knock. "Inspector Craddock, Mrs. Hargrove is expecting you. This way, sir." The morning room had been transformed since Miss Marple's visit. The tea things were cleared away. A low table now held a decanter of sherry and glasses, though none had been touched. Lydia Hargrove stood by the window, her back to the light. She turned as Craddock entered. "Inspector, thank you for coming so promptly." Craddock inclined his head. "My condolences, Mrs. Hargrove. I regret the necessity of troubling you at such a time." She gestured to a chair. "Trouble is inevitable, I suppose. Please sit." He took the seat opposite hers. Arthur Hargrove entered a moment later, still in the same rumpled suit he had worn the night before. His eyes were shadowed, his manner restless. Reverend Ellis followed almost immediately, carrying a small leather-bound prayer book as though it were a talisman. Miss Emily Croft was last, moving with the careful steps of someone who has not slept. Craddock waited until they were all seated before opening his notebook. "I shall be as brief as possible," he began. "The coroner has ordered a post-mortem, which is routine in cases of sudden death. I am here to gather preliminary statements so that the inquest may proceed smoothly. I shall speak to each of you separately, and if that is agreeable—" No one objected. He began with Lydia. They moved to the small library across the hall, a room lined with glass-fronted bookcases and dominated by a large desk still bearing the colonel's blotter and inkstand. Craddock closed the door behind them. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, "tell me, in your own words, what happened last night." She sat very straight, hands folded in her lap. "We dined at 8. The meal was uneventful. My husband proposed a toast. He reached across the table and took my hand. He said, 'My dear.' Then his face changed. He gripped my fingers very tightly. I tried to pull away, but could not. He slumped forward. That was all." Craddock made a note. "Did he complain of feeling unwell at any point during the evening?" "No. He ate normally. And he drank 2 glasses of claret and a small brandy with his coffee." "The brandy? Was it poured by anyone in particular?" "Simmons poured it, as always. It was the colonel's own decanter." Craddock turned a page. "You did not yourself touch the brandy?" "I dislike brandy. I had none." He regarded her for a moment. "When your husband took your hand, did you notice anything unusual about his manner? Any word? Any look?" "Only the word I have already told you. My dear. Nothing else." Craddock closed the notebook. "Thank you. I shall speak to the others now." Arthur was next. He paced the library as he spoke, unable to keep still. "I was sitting opposite Uncle. He seemed perfectly all right. Joked about my latest sculpture, a bit sharply, but that was his way. Then the toast. Then he reached for Aunt Lydia's hand. Next thing I knew, he was clutching it like a vice. I jumped up, tried to help. Nothing doing. He was gone." "Any recent quarrels?" Craddock asked. Arthur stopped pacing. "We argued about money. I owed him rather a lot. He was pressing for repayment, but it was nothing new." "How much?" £300. A loan for materials and rent. He said he'd call it in after Christmas." Craddock noted the figure. "And last night?" "He mentioned it again at table. Said the discussion was closed." That was all. Reverend Ellis spoke quietly when his turn came. He sat with his hands still clasped, as though in perpetual prayer. I sat to the colonel's left. The conversation was general. Village matters, the harvest festival. He seemed in good spirits. After the toast, he took Mrs. Hargrove's hand. I saw his face alter. I rose at once. I felt for a pulse. There was none. "Had the colonel confided in you recently?" Craddock asked. The vicar hesitated. "He came to see me 3 weeks ago. Spoke of burdens, old sins, he called them. He was troubled in conscience. I urged him to make what amends he could." "Did he say what those sins were?" "No. Only that they concerned a time long past. India, I believe." Miss Croft was the most voluble. She sat twisting a lace handkerchief between her fingers. "My brother was never ill. Never. He walked 5 miles every morning, ate plain food, slept like a child. Last night he was himself. Brusque, perhaps, but himself. Then that dreadful moment. His poor hand locked round Lydia's. I fainted, I'm afraid. When I came to, they were trying to loosen his fingers." "Any recent disagreements in the family?" Craddock inquired. Miss Croft's lips thinned. "Money. Always money. Arthur's extravagance. Reginald was generous once, but patience has limits. And Lydia, she stopped. Yes? Nothing. Only that she married rather late. Reginald was lonely after our parents died. She brought animation to the house. Craddock thanked her and returned to the morning room, where he asked that the entire party reassemble. When they had gathered, he addressed them collectively. The post-mortem will take place tomorrow. Until the results are known, I must ask that none of you leave the district without informing me. The dining room will remain locked for the present. I have asked the servants to preserve everything as it was: plates, glasses, the decanter. One further point: the Colonel's brandy glass showed a slight film on the rim. It will be analyzed. If any of you recall anything further, anything at all, please tell me. He paused, letting the words settle. Arthur spoke first. You're suggesting poison? I am suggesting nothing, Craddock replied. I am collecting facts. Lydia rose. If that is all, Inspector, I should like to rest. Of course. As the others filed out, Craddock remained behind. He crossed to the window and looked down the terraced gardens toward the lake. A figure moved among the rose beds. Miss Jane Marple, basket on arm, apparently gathering late blooms. She glanced up, saw him watching, and raised a hand in polite greeting. Craddock returned the gesture, then turned away. He spent the next hour in the dining room with the butler. Simmons confirmed the sequence of service. The brandy had been poured from the decanter on the sideboard, but only the Colonel had taken any. The glass had been clean when set out. No one had approached it after pouring. Craddock examined the glass himself. A faint powdery residue clung to the inside rim, barely visible unless the light struck it at the correct angle. He wrapped it carefully in tissue and placed it in his case. Before leaving, he spoke once more to Lydia in the hall. One last question, if I may. Your husband's hand, when you tried to free yourself, did you succeed at any point? No, she said, not until after he was dead. Even then, it required 2 of the servants to loosen the fingers. Craddock nodded. Thank you. He walked back to the village as dusk gathered, the sky turning from gold to violet. At the cottage he had engaged for the night, a small place near the church, he reviewed his notes by lamplight. On heart failure or poison? The grip suggested spasm, consistent with certain toxins. Digitalis could cause that: slowed heart, then sudden stop, with rigidity in the extremities. Easy to obtain in a garden, easy to administer in a drink. Yet motive? Money, perhaps, for Arthur. Freedom, perhaps, for Lydia. Old scores, perhaps, for the vicar or the sister. Or none of these. A knock sounded at the door. The landlady announced a visitor, Miss Jane Marple. Craddock received her in the tiny parlor. She carried a small tin of shortbread. I thought you might be hungry after your journey, she said. Train food is never satisfactory. He accepted the tin with a faint smile. You are very kind and observant. She settled into the armchair opposite. I have lived in villages a long time, Inspector. One learns to notice things. Such as? Oh, small things. The way Mrs. Hargrove holds her hands, never quite relaxed. The way Mr. Arthur taps his foot when money is mentioned. The way Reverend Ellis keeps his fingers laced together, as though afraid to let go of something. And the Colonel's last word, my dear. Spoken to his wife, of course, but perhaps not only to her. Craddock regarded her steadily. You were not present at dinner? No. But I was watching the house yesterday evening. From my cousin's garden. I saw the lights, the silhouettes at the windows. And this morning I called with preserves. One sees a great deal from a garden bench. He leaned forward slightly. If you have observed anything material. I have observed only human nature, she said. And human nature, Inspector, is the same everywhere, even in the Cotswolds. People cling to what they fear losing, or to what they have never truly possessed. She rose. I shall not keep you. Good night. After she had gone, Craddock opened his notebook again. He wrote one line at the bottom of the page. Miss Marple, local observer. Underestimate at peril. Outside, the church clock struck 9. Willowmere slept under a canopy of stars, but in the manor, in the cottages, in the inspector's small parlor, the threads of inquiry continued to tighten, drawing the household ever closer to the moment when truth would emerge. Sharp, unexpected, and final. Chapter 5. Echoes from the Past. The post-mortem results reached Inspector Craddock at the village police station shortly before noon the following day. A brief telegram from the county pathologist, followed by a more detailed report delivered by motorcycle courier, confirmed what he had half expected: death by digitalis poisoning. The alkaloid had been present in sufficient quantity to cause ventricular fibrillation, followed by cardiac arrest. The spasm in the hand muscles, the rigid, unyielding grip, had been a classic sign. No other abnormalities, no struggle, no violence, only poison administered in the brandy, almost certainly within the last half hour of the colonel's life. Craddock read the report twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his attaché case. He walked the short distance to Willowmere Manor, under a sky that had turned gray and threatening, promising rain before evening. The house looked unchanged, serene, golden against the darkening hills. Yet the atmosphere inside had altered subtly. Doors closed a little more quickly. Voices dropped lower. Eyes followed him as he passed through the hall. He requested the library again, this time asking that the desk be left exactly as the colonel had last used it. The blotter still bore faint impressions of the last letter written, a note to his bank manager concerning a transfer of funds. Craddock lifted it carefully. Beneath lay 3 drawers. The top one contained checkbooks, pens, a small leather diary. The middle held personal correspondence, mostly bills and military pension statements. The bottom drawer was locked. He summoned Simmons. The colonel kept this drawer locked. Yes, sir. Always. He carried the key on his watch chain. Craddock produced the chain, removed from the body the previous night. The small brass key fitted perfectly. Inside lay a thin bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, a single photograph in a plain frame, and a slim notebook bound in calfskin. He examined the photograph first. It showed a much younger Reginald Hargrove, smooth-faced, in tropical uniform, standing beside a young woman in a sari, her head modestly veiled, a small boy of perhaps 4 or 5 years clinging to her skirt. The background was unmistakably Indian. A wide veranda, palm trees, a punkah hanging motionless in the still air. On the reverse, in faded ink, Simla, 1918. R, Mira, and little Ravi. Craddock set the photograph aside and untied the letters. They were few, 6 in all, written in a neat, feminine hand on thin notepaper. The earliest dated from 1919. The last from 1922. They spoke of regret, of promises made and broken, of a child growing up in a mission orphanage near Pune, And the final letter ended abruptly. If you cannot acknowledge him openly, at least send word that he is not forgotten. He asks for you still. No signature, only an initial. M. The notebook contained entries in the Colonel's own firm hand. Dates, sums of money, brief notes. Sent to Orphanage Fund, £50. 1925. School fees paid through agency. 1930. Last payment. Boy now 18. No further contact. The entries ceased in 1936. Craddock closed the drawer and locked it again. He sat for some minutes in the Colonel's chair, staring at the photograph. A secret son. A child given up. Payments made in silence over nearly 2 decades. And then, nothing. He rose and went in search of Lydia Hargrove. She was in the drawing room, alone, a book open on her lap, though she did not appear to be reading. Craddock entered without knocking. "Mrs. Hargrove, I have the post-mortem results. Your husband died of digitalis poisoning." She closed the book slowly. "I thought it might be so." "You suspected poison?" "I suspected something unnatural. He was not a man to die easily." Craddock took the seat opposite. "I have also found certain papers in his desk, letters and a photograph concerning a child born in India during the war. A son. Do you know anything of this?" Lydia's face remained composed, yet a faint color rose along her cheekbones. "I knew he had been married before. Briefly. In India. The marriage ended when he returned to England. He never spoke of it after we were wed." "And the child?" "He mentioned once, years ago, that there had been complications. I did not press him." Craddock produced the photograph from his pocket and laid it on the low table between them. Lydia looked at it for a long moment. "The boy resembles him," she said quietly. "The eyes, the set of the mouth. Did your husband ever speak of trying to trace him, of making contact?" "Not in recent years. He said the past was best left buried." Craddock returned the photograph to his pocket. "Thank you." He found Arthur in the billiard room, cue in hand, though the balls lay untouched on the green baize. The young man looked up as Craddock entered. "Bad news, I take it?" "Poison," Craddock said simply. "Digitalis. From the garden, most likely." Arthur set the cue down with a clatter. "Then someone here did it. Someone had the opportunity, and perhaps the motive." Arthur laughed shortly. "You mean me, of course. The nephew with debts. The one uncle was about to cut off." "Were you?" "I don't know. He threatened it often enough. But he never followed through." Craddock regarded him steadily. "I spoke to the gardener this morning. He remembers you and your uncle arguing violently near the rose beds 2 days ago. Something about the studio wing of the manor. You wanted it for your work. He refused." Arthur's jaw tightened. "He said it would go to charity after his death. A soldier's home or some such nonsense. I lost my temper. Said things I shouldn't have. But I didn't kill him." "Where were you between the coffee being served and the moment your uncle collapsed?" "In my seat, talking to Aunt Lydia about a gallery exhibition in Cheltenham. Ask her." "I shall." Craddock left him there, cue still in hand, staring at the empty table as though it held answers he could not read. Miss Emily Croft was in her bedroom on the first floor, surrounded by open suitcases and stacks of pressed flowers laid out on tissue paper. She started when Craddock knocked. "Inspector, come in. I was just sorting a few things. One must keep busy." Craddock remained standing near the door. "Miss Croft, your brother kept records of payments made over many years to an orphanage in India, for a boy named Ravi. Did you know of this?" Miss Croft's hands stilled on a spray of dried lavender. I knew there had been a child. Reginald told me once, after too much port. A youthful indiscretion, he called it. He said he had done what was proper, provided for the boy without bringing scandal on the family. Did you ever meet the mother, or see the child? Never. It was all done through lawyers and missionaries. Reginald preferred it that way. Craddock produced the photograph again. Miss Croft took it with trembling fingers. Poor little thing, she murmured. He looks just like Reginald at that age. Did your brother ever express regret? Or a wish to see the boy grown up? She handed the photograph back. Reginald did not believe in regrets. He believed in duty. He paid. That was enough. Craddock thanked her and left. The rain began as he descended the stairs, soft at first, then harder, drumming against the windows. He found Reverend Ellis in the small conservatory at the back of the house, surrounded by ferns and potted palms. The vicar was watering a tray of seedlings with a brass can, his movements precise and unhurried. "Inspector, you have news, I think." "Poison," Craddock said. "Confirmed." Ellis set the can down. "I feared as much. The suddenness, the rigidity, and it reminded me of cases I read about in my theological days, when I studied poisons in relation to Scripture. Foxglove was mentioned more than once." Craddock took out his notebook. "The Colonel spoke to you some weeks ago, of burdens, old sins. Did he mention a child? A son born in India?" The vicar's hands tightened on the edge of the potting bench. "He spoke in general terms. Guilt over a life left behind. A promise unkept. I counseled confession and restitution. He said it was too late for that." "Did he name the child?" "No. But he said the boy had grown to manhood without knowing his father. That the knowledge would only bring pain." Craddock studied him. "You have kept your hands clasped a great deal since the death, Reverend. Even now." Ellis looked down at his fingers, still interlaced. "A habit. Nothing more. Or perhaps a way of holding oneself together." The vicar smiled faintly. "Perhaps." Craddock left him among the ferns. That evening, as the rain eased to a steady drizzle, Miss Jane Marple called again at the manor. She carried no basket this time, only an umbrella and a small notebook of her own. Simmons showed her into the morning room, where Lydia sat alone by the fire. "Miss Marple, you are persistent." "I am curious," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Curiosity is a great help in understanding people." Lydia gestured to the chair opposite. "Sit then. Ask what you will." Miss Marple settled herself. "I have been thinking about hands. Your husband's hand, locked around yours. It was not a gentle clasp. It was desperate, almost fearful." Lydia looked into the fire. "He was dying. A people cling in extremity. Yet he said only, 'My dear,' not your name, not Lydia, just 'my dear,' as though he saw someone else in that last moment." Lydia's gaze remained on the flames. "He may have done." Miss Marple opened her notebook. "There was a woman once, in India. Mira, her name was, and a child, Ravi. Your husband provided for them quietly, then stopped. Do you think the boy ever tried to find him?" "I have no idea." Miss Marple closed the notebook. "Human nature is very consistent. A child denied a father will either forget him or remember him every day of his life." She rose. "I shall not trouble you further tonight." As she reached the door, Lydia spoke. "Miss Marple." "Yes, my dear?" "If the boy did come looking, what would he want? Money? Recognition? Revenge?" Miss Marple paused, perhaps only to be seen. Once. Ah, properly seen. She left Lydia staring into the fire, the rain tapping insistently against the window panes. Outside, the village lay quiet under wet roofs. Lights burned late in cottage windows. Whispers continued, softer now, more speculative. And in the manor library, Inspector Craddock sat alone with the photograph and the notebook, turning them over in his mind like pieces of a puzzle that had only just begun to show its shape. Somewhere in the house, or perhaps beyond it, a secret long buried was stirring, and the hand that had clutched so tightly in death had been reaching, not merely for a wife, but for something, or someone, lost in the past. Chapter 6. Confrontations by the Lake. The rain of the previous day had left the Cotswolds' air washed clean, every leaf and blade of grass glistening as though newly varnished. By mid-morning the sun had broken through, turning the lake at Willowmere Manor into a sheet of pale gold. Swans moved across its surface with slow, deliberate grace, their reflections perfect and undisturbed. The gardens, still heavy with moisture, gave off a rich scent of wet earth and late roses. It was the kind of morning that invited quiet reflection. Yet reflection, in this house, had become a dangerous occupation. Lydia Hargrove descended the terrace steps shortly after 11, secateurs in hand, a wide-brimmed straw hat shielding her face from the sun. She wore a simple linen dress of pale green, the color almost exactly matching the water lilies that floated near the shore. She walked without haste along the gravel path that skirted the lake, pausing now and then to clip a spent bloom or remove a dead leaf. Her movements were precise, economical, as though each snip were a small act of control in a world that had suddenly slipped beyond her grasp. She reached the rose arbor, a tunnel of climbing varieties trained over iron frames, and began working there, cutting back the laterals as the head gardener had taught her years before. The thorns caught at her gloves. She ignored them. She was alone, or so she believed. Arthur Hargrove had watched her from the upper landing window. He had not slept well. His eyes were shadowed, his jaw set in a line of suppressed anger. He waited until she was well into the arbor before leaving the house. He carried no tool, no pretext, only the need to speak what had been burning in him since the moment his uncle's hand had locked round Lydia's wrist. He approached quietly, boots soft on the damp grass. When he reached the entrance to the arbor, he stopped. "Aunt Lydia!" She did not turn at once. She continued clipping, the secateurs making small, decisive clicks. "I saw you from the house," he said. "You're very calm this morning." She answered without looking round. "One must occupy oneself. Idle hands invite idle thoughts." Arthur stepped under the arch of roses. The scent was heavy, almost cloying. Idle thoughts? Or guilty ones? Now she turned. The brim of her hat cast a shadow across her eyes, but he could see the tightness of her mouth. "What do you want, Arthur?" "I want to know what really happened at that table. Uncle didn't just die. Someone made sure he did. And you were the one holding his hand when it happened." Lydia set the secateurs down on the stone bench beside her. "Are you accusing me?" "I'm asking, and there's a difference." She regarded him steadily. "Ask away, then." He took another step closer. "He was going to change the will. I know it. He told me the studio wing would never be mine, that it was going to some charity for old soldiers. He said I'd wasted enough of his money on foolish dreams. His words. And then, the very next night, he's dead. Convenient. wouldn't you say? For whom? Lydia asked quietly. For you. You inherit the house, the money, everything. No more putting up with his tempers, his rules, his endless talk of duty. Freedom, at last. Lydia removed her gloves slowly, one finger at a time. Beneath them, on the inside of her left wrist, was a thin, pale scar that encircled it like a faint bracelet mark. Old, faded, but unmistakable. "Do you know how I got this?" she said. Arthur glanced at it, then away. No. Reginald gave it to me. Not deliberately. It was an accident. Years ago, the first winter we were married. He caught my wrist when I tried to leave the room during one of his rages. The bracelet I was wearing snapped. The clasp cut me. He was horrified. Apologized for days. Bought me a new one, gold, heavier, so it would never break again. I wore it until the day he died. Arthur stared at the scar. Why tell me this now? Because you think I hated him enough to kill him. I didn't. I endured him. There is a difference. Arthur's voice dropped. But you knew about the child, the boy in India. You saw the photograph when the inspector showed it. You weren't surprised. Lydia looked past him, toward the lake. I suspected. Husbands who have lived abroad often bring shadows home with them. I never asked. Asking would have meant listening to answers I did not wish to hear. So you let him carry the guilt alone? I let him carry what he chose to carry. Men like Reginald prefer it that way. Arthur laughed bitterly. And now he's dead, and the guilt is gone. How convenient. Lydia picked up the secateurs again. Convenience is a word the police use, Arthur, not widows. She turned back to the roses. The conversation, as far as she was concerned, was finished. Arthur stood a moment longer, fists clenched at his sides, then walked away. He did not notice the figure that had been standing motionless behind the high yew hedge at the far end of the arbor. Miss Jane Marple had arrived early that morning with a small trug of cuttings from her cousin's garden, ostensibly to offer them to the head gardener. She had lingered near the lake, to knitting in the shelter of the hedge, and had heard every word. She waited until Arthur's footsteps had faded, then stepped out onto the path. Lydia had not moved. She was still clipping roses, though her hands were no longer quite steady. "Good morning, Mrs. Hargrove," Miss Marple said pleasantly. Lydia looked up, startled but not alarmed. "Miss Marple, you have a habit of appearing quietly." "I find hedges very useful for that," Miss Marple replied. "They give one time to think, and to listen, sometimes." Lydia set the secateurs down once more. "You heard." "I heard enough. Human nature is very revealing when people believe themselves unobserved." Lydia removed her hat and laid it on the bench. Her dark hair was slightly damp from the morning air. "And what did you make of it?" "That Mr. Arthur is frightened, and that you are not as indifferent as you pretend." Lydia gave a small, mirthless smile. Indifference is a useful garment. It keeps one warm in cold houses. Miss Marple nodded. "The scar on your wrist. It tells its own story. It tells only that bracelets can be dangerous things, and that some men grip too tightly when they are afraid of losing what they have." Miss Marple glanced toward the lake. "Your husband gripped very tightly indeed at the end, almost as though he recognized someone in that last moment, someone he had not expected to see." Lydia followed her gaze. He was dying. The mind plays tricks. Perhaps, or perhaps it sees clearly for the first time. They stood in silence for a little while. A swan glided past, its wake rippling the golden water. "I shall leave you to your roses," Miss Marple said at last. But one small observation, if I may. Gloves hide a great many things, scars, for instance, but they also prevent one from feeling properly. Sometimes it is better to feel the thorns." She walked away along the path, her sensible shoes crunching softly on the gravel. That evening, as dusk settled over the valley, another figure moved through the gardens. Reverend Theodore Ellis left the house by the side door, a small torch in one hand, his prayer book in the other. He claimed, when questioned later, that he had gone to retrieve a hymnal he believed he had dropped near the boathouse during an earlier walk. The excuse was plausible. The boathouse was a favorite spot for quiet reading, and the colonel had often allowed him the use of it. Yet his path did not take him directly to the boathouse. Instead, he skirted the lake, keeping to the shadow of the willows until he reached the rose arbor. There he paused, switched off the torch, and stood listening. The house was quiet. Most of the lights had been extinguished. Only a single lamp burned in the drawing-room window, where Lydia sat alone with a book she was not reading. Ellis stepped into the arbor. He did not touch the roses. He simply stood in the center, breathing in the scent, his hands clasped tightly before him as always. From the hedge came a soft rustle. Arthur Hargrove emerged, cigarette glowing in the dark. "You followed me," Ellis said without turning. "I saw you leave. Thought I'd see where a man of God goes after dark." Ellis turned slowly. "I came to think. The arbor is peaceful." "Peaceful enough to plan a murder?" Arthur asked. Ellis did not flinch. "If you believe I killed your uncle, say so plainly." "I believe someone did. And you've been holding something back since the moment he died. Those clasped hands of yours never let go for a second, as though you're afraid of what they might do if you released them." Ellis looked down at his fingers. "A habit of prayer. Nothing sinister. Or a habit of guilt." The vicar raised his eyes. "Guilt is a heavy burden, Mr. Hargrove, but it belongs to those who have earned it." Arthur stepped closer. "What did my uncle confess to you? He came to you weeks ago. Troubled, you said. Old sins. What sins?" Ellis hesitated. "He spoke of a promise unkept, a child left behind, a life shaped by absence rather than presence." Arthur's cigarette fell to the ground. He ground it out with his heel. "The boy in the photograph. Ravi." Ellis nodded once. "You knew." "I knew only what he told me. He asked for absolution. I could not give it, not fully. Some things require more than words." Arthur's voice was low, dangerous. "Did you hate him for it?" "I pitied him," Ellis said. "Pity can be a sharper blade than hatred." They stood facing each other in the dimness, the scent of roses thick around them. Neither moved. From the house came the sound of a window opening. Lydia, perhaps, taking air. The two men separated without another word. Arthur returned to the manor by the terrace steps. Ellis waited until the window closed, then walked slowly toward the boathouse, torch unlit now, hands still clasped. Inspector Craddock, who had been watching from the library window with field glasses borrowed from the colonel's study, lowered them and made a note in his book. Miss Marple, knitting by lamplight in her cousin's sitting room half a mile away, looked up as the church clock struck 10. "Hands," she murmured to the empty room. "So much depends on hands. Who holds? Who lets go? Who reaches too late?" Outside, the lake lay still under the stars. The swans slept with heads tucked beneath wings, and in the gardens of Willowmere Manor the night held its breath, waiting for the next thread to tighten. Chapter 7. The Gathering and the Truth. The drawing-room of Willowmere Manor had seldom looked more imposing than it did that evening. Twilight had deepened into full night. The long windows stood black against the glass, reflecting the lamplight and the faces of those gathered within. A fire burned steadily in the Adam grate, casting a warm, unsteady glow across the room. Yet the warmth did not reach the corners where shadows clung. The air held the faint scent of wood smoke, roses brought in from the garden that morning, and something sharper, anticipation, perhaps, or dread. Inspector Craddock had chosen the hour deliberately. 8:30, the same time the fatal dinner had begun 3 nights earlier. The same chairs had been arranged around the low oval table where coffee had been served. The Colonel's place at the head remained empty, though his armchair had been left precisely as it was. No one sat in it. Lydia Hargrove occupied her usual seat to the right, dressed in unrelieved black, a single strand of pearls at her throat. Her posture was erect, her hands folded in her lap. She might have been attending a tedious committee meeting rather than an inquiry into murder. Arthur sat opposite, one leg crossed tightly over the other, fingers drumming an irregular rhythm on the arm of his chair. Miss Emily Croft perched on the edge of her seat, handkerchief twisted between her fingers, eyes darting from face to face. Reverend Theodore Ellis sat a little apart, near the fireplace, his clerical collar stark white in the lamplight, hands once more clasped before him as though in perpetual supplication. Miss Jane Marple had been invited at Inspector Craddock's suggestion. She occupied a small armchair near the window, knitting quietly, needles clicking with the regularity of a metronome. No one questioned her presence. By now, her quiet observations had acquired an authority of their own. Craddock stood before the empty fireplace, notebook in hand. He had discarded his overcoat. His suit was dark, unremarkable, yet his manner carried the quiet weight of inevitability. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I shall not waste words. The post-mortem has confirmed that Colonel Hargrove died from digitalis poisoning. The poison was in the brandy poured into his glass after dinner. The dose was sufficient to cause rapid heart failure. The residue on the rim of the glass matches foxglove leaves from the border, beside the rose arbor. Leaves that could have been gathered, crushed, and added to the decanter in a matter of minutes by anyone who knew the house." He paused, letting the statement settle. No fingerprints were found on the decanter beyond those of Simmons and the Colonel himself. The glass was handled only by the butler when he poured, and by the Colonel when he drank. "That suggests the poison was introduced earlier, perhaps during the brief interval when the coffee tray was left unattended on the sideboard while the servants cleared the main course." Arthur leaned forward. "Then anyone in this room could have done it." "Precisely," Craddock said. "Opportunity was equal. Motive, however, is another matter." He turned first to Arthur. "Mr. Hargrove, you were in financial difficulties. Your uncle had lent you substantial sums, £300 recently, and had threatened to withhold further support. He had also decided against bequeathing you the studio wing you desired for your work. You argued violently with him 2 days before his death. You were seated directly opposite him at table, and you could have approached the sideboard during the momentary confusion when Miss Croft dropped her napkin and Simmons bent to retrieve it. Arthur's face flushed. I didn't touch the decanter. I was talking to Aunt Lydia about an exhibition. Ask her. Lydia inclined her head fractionally. He was. Craddock turned to her. Mrs. Hargrove, you stood to inherit the entire estate. House, investments, contents, subject only to a few small legacies. Your marriage, by all accounts, was not a love match. You endured certain constraints. The scar on your wrist bears witness to at least one occasion when your husband's grip was too tight. You sat closest to him. Your hand was the one he clasped in death. Lydia met his gaze without flinching. I did not poison my husband, Inspector. If I had wished to be free of him, there were quieter ways. Craddock nodded, then addressed Miss Croft. Miss Croft, you lived in your brother's house on his generosity. You had long nursed certain resentments, his brusque manner, his preference for his wife over his sister, his decision to leave the bulk of his fortune elsewhere. You knew the gardens intimately. You often gathered flowers for pressing. Foxglove would have been familiar to you. Miss Croft gave a small, startled gasp. I would never. I loved Reginald. He was my brother. Love and resentment can coexist, Craddock observed. Finally, he turned to the vicar. Reverend Ellis, you were seated to the colonel's left. You had his confidence. He came to you weeks ago confessing old sins, a child born out of wedlock in India, a promise of care unfulfilled, payments made in secret and then discontinued. You counseled him to make amends. He refused. You knew the house, the routines, the gardens. You were seen near the lake the evening after the death, and again last night in the rose arbor, places where foxglove grows in abundance. Ellis remained still, though the knuckles of his clasped hands showed white. Craddock closed his notebook with a soft snap. I have considered each of you in turn. Greed, freedom, resentment, moral outrage, all plausible, yet none quite fits. The manner of the colonel's death, the desperate, rigid grip on his wife's hand, the single word, my dear, spoken in the moment of recognition, suggests something more personal, more intimate than ordinary hatred or gain. He looked slowly round the circle. The truth lies not in what was done, but in what was never done, in a promise never kept, and in a name never acknowledged. Silence fell, thick and expectant. Miss Marple set her knitting in her lap. The needles ceased their clicking. If I may, Inspector, she said quietly. Craddock inclined his head. Please, Miss Marple. She rose, small, neat, unassuming, and moved to the center of the room. The firelight caught the soft gray of her hair and the calm certainty of her eyes. It is not a question of money, she began, nor of hatred in the usual sense. It is a question of recognition, of being seen. She turned first to Lydia. You, Mrs. Hargrove, married a man who carried a secret. You suspected it, endured it, but never spoke of it. In his last moment, when he clutched your hand, he was not seeing you. He was seeing someone else, a woman from long ago, a woman who had borne his child and then vanished from his life. And he said, my dear, not to you, but to her. In that instant of dying, the face above him blurred, and he reached for the one he had wronged most deeply. Lydia's lips parted, but no sound came. Miss Marple turned to Arthur. You, Mr. Hargrove, were angry about money and inheritance, but your uncle's death has not solved your difficulties, only complicated them. You are innocent of this crime, though not of resentment. She looked next at Miss Croft. You loved your brother, Miss Croft, even when he wounded you. You knew of the child, but you kept his secret as he wished. You are not the one who ended his life." Finally, she faced Reverend Ellis. The vicar had not moved. His hands remained clasped, but now they trembled very slightly. "You, Reverend," Miss Marple said gently, "are the child." A sharp intake of breath from Miss Croft. Arthur leaned forward, eyes wide. Lydia's composure cracked for the first time. One hand rose to her throat. Ellis did not deny it. He looked at Miss Marple with something like relief. "How did you know?" he asked, voice low. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Small things. The way you kept your hands clasped, as though holding yourself together. The scar on Mrs. Hargrove's wrist, which you noticed but never remarked upon. The photograph in the Colonel's desk. You resemble him far more than any casual observer might suppose. The eyes, the line of the jaw, and the name. Theodore Ellis. A plain English name. But your mother was Mira. You would have had another name once. Ravi, perhaps." Ellis bowed his head. "I was Ravi," he said, "until I was 6. Then the orphanage renamed me for an English saint and an English surname, and I grew up knowing only that my father had been a soldier who could not acknowledge me. I entered the church because it seemed a place where questions of paternity might be set aside. I came to this parish by chance, or so I thought. Then, last year, I found the old records, letters, payments, the name Hargrove. I came to Willowmere not as a vicar seeking a living, but as a son seeking a father." He looked up. "I confronted him 6 weeks ago. In this very room. I showed him the letters. I asked only one thing, that he look at me, really look, and say my name. Not Ravi, if he preferred not, but something, anything that acknowledged I existed." The room was utterly still. "He refused," Ellis continued. "He said the past was dead, that to speak now would destroy his reputation, his wife's peace, his sister's standing. He offered money. More money. I refused. I told him I would wait, that one day he would see me whether he wished to or not." Miss Marple spoke again, her voice soft but clear. "And so you waited. You watched. You learned the routines of the house. You knew the Colonel took brandy after dinner. You knew the decanter stood on the sideboard. You knew foxglove grew in the garden. Digitalis, the old remedy for the heart that can also stop it. You waited until the night when the family gathered, when the past and the present met under one roof." Ellis nodded once. "I crushed the leaves the afternoon before, a small amount in the decanter, while Simmons was in the pantry. I did not intend a painful death, only a swift one. When he clutched his wife's hand, when he whispered, 'My dear,' I knew he had seen me at last. Not as the vicar, not as Theodore Ellis, as the son he had never claimed." He looked round at the faces staring at him. "I wanted him to live long enough to understand what he had denied. I wanted him to die knowing." Craddock stepped forward. "Reverend Ellis, Theodore Ellis, or Ravi, if you prefer, you will accompany me to Gloucester. You will be charged with the murder of Colonel Reginald Hargrove." Ellis rose slowly. He looked at Lydia. "I am sorry," he said. "Not for what I did, but for what it has done to you." Lydia did not answer. Her eyes were dry, but the hand at her throat trembled. Miss Marple returned to her chair and took up her knitting once more. The needles resumed their quiet rhythm. Outside, the night pressed against the windows. The lake lay black and still. Somewhere in the garden, foxgloves stood tall and innocent, and their purple bells closed against the dark. One life had ended, Another would soon be taken into custody. And in the drawing-room of Willowmere Manor, the truth, at last, had been spoken aloud. Chapter 8. The Quiet Aftermath. The morning after Reverend Ellis was taken away dawned with the kind of deceptive serenity that follows a storm. The Cotswolds sky had cleared to a pale, washed blue. Sunlight slanted across the valley, turning the honeystone of Willowmere Manor to soft gold once more. Dew still clung to the rose petals in the arbor, and the lake mirrored the sky without a ripple. Swans drifted in lazy circles, as though the events of the previous night had never disturbed their placid routine. Yet the house itself seemed changed, quieter, emptier, its windows reflecting light rather than holding secrets. Lydia Hargrove rose early, and before the servants had finished laying the breakfast table. She walked through the rooms she had known for 15 years, touching nothing, merely looking. In the library, she paused before the colonel's desk. The bottom drawer stood open. The photograph and the bundle of letters had been removed by Inspector Craddock for evidence. She closed the drawer with a soft click, then crossed to the window and gazed down at the lake. The scar on her wrist caught the light, a thin silver line, no longer hidden by bracelets or gloves. She traced it absently with one finger, then let her hand fall. She had not wept. Not when Ellis confessed, not when the handcuffs were placed on his wrists, not when the police motor car drove away down the gravel sweep. Tears, she had decided long ago, were a luxury she could not afford. Instead, she felt a curious emptiness, as though a long-held tension had been released, leaving only the ache of muscles no longer braced. By 9 o'clock, the first decisions had been made. She summoned Simmons to the morning room. "I shall be leaving Willowmere," she told him. "The house will be placed on the market immediately. You and the other servants will receive 3 months' wages in lieu of notice, together with excellent references. I expect the place to sell quickly. There are always buyers for such houses in the Cotswolds." Simmons bowed slightly. "Very good, madam. And yourself?" "London, for the present. After that, I have not decided." He hesitated. "If I may be permitted, madam, the colonel would have wished the house to remain in the family." Lydia's smile was small and without warmth. "The colonel wished many things that never came to pass. He is no longer here to wish." Simmons withdrew without further comment. Arthur Hargrove appeared shortly afterwards, unshaven, his eyes heavy from a sleepless night. He found Lydia still in the morning room, sorting through a small pile of papers, letters of condolence that had begun to arrive with the morning post. "I heard you're selling," he said, without preamble. "Yes." He leaned against the doorframe. "You don't want to keep it? It's yours now, free and clear." "I do not wish to live in a house where every room reminds me of what happened, or of what never happened." Arthur pushed himself upright. "You mean the boy, Ellis, my cousin, I suppose?" Lydia looked up. "Half-cousin, perhaps. The blood tie is there, and whether acknowledged or not." He crossed the room and dropped into the chair opposite hers. "I keep thinking about that last moment. Uncle reaching for your hand, saying, 'My dear.' He thought he was seeing her, his Mira. Not you, not even Ellis. Just a ghost from 20 years ago." "Ghosts are powerful," Lydia said quietly. "They can kill as surely as poison." Arthur rubbed his face with both hands. "I hated him sometimes. The way he doled out money like favors, the way he judged my work without ever looking at it properly. But I didn't want him dead. I wanted him to see me, the way Ellis wanted him to see him. Lydia folded the last letter and set it aside. We all wanted to be seen. He never had the habit of looking. They sat in silence for some minutes. Outside, a blackbird sang from the top of the copper beech, its notes clear and insistent. "I'm going back to London tomorrow," Arthur said at last. "I've a commission waiting, small, but it will pay the rent. After that, I don't know. Perhaps I'll try something different, less heroic, more honest." Lydia regarded him. "You have talent, Arthur. Waste less of it on resentment and more on the work itself. That is the only inheritance worth having." He gave a crooked smile. "High praise from you." "Not praise. Observation." He stood. "Will you come to the funeral?" "Next week, in the village church." "I shall attend," she said, "out of duty, not sentiment." Arthur nodded once, then left the room. His footsteps echoed along the corridor, growing fainter until the house swallowed them. Miss Emily Croft remained in her bedroom most of the day, surrounded by her albums of pressed flowers, while she had not spoken much since the drawing-room gathering. When Lydia knocked and entered, she found the older woman seated at her small writing table, a spray of dried lavender in her hand. "Emily," Lydia said gently. Miss Croft looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but dry. "I keep thinking of him as a boy," she said. "Reginald, I mean. Before India. Before any of this. He was kind then. Gentle, almost. The army changed him. Or perhaps India did. Or perhaps we all change when we carry secrets too long." Lydia sat on the edge of the bed. "You knew about the child?" "Only vaguely. He told me once, after too much brandy, that there had been a woman, a son. He said he had done his duty by sending money. Duty was always enough for Reginald. It excused everything." Lydia reached out and touched the lavender. "He never told me the boy's name, not even when I asked, years later." Miss Croft set the spray down carefully. He was ashamed, not of the act, of the silence that followed. He thought silence was strength. It was cowardice. They sat together for a little while, two women who had shared a house and a man without ever truly sharing anything else. "I shall go to Bath," Miss Croft said at last. "There is a small hotel I know, quiet, respectable. I have enough from the annuity Reginald settled on me. I shall take my albums and my flowers. Perhaps I shall start a new collection. Alpine plants, maybe. Something that grows where nothing else will." Lydia rose. "You will be welcome to visit, wherever I settle." Miss Croft smiled faintly. "We shall see." The funeral took place 5 days later, on a crisp November morning when the valley was veiled in thin mist. The village church was full. Parishioners, old army comrades who had travelled from Cheltenham and Gloucester, a handful of London acquaintances who had known the colonel in his later years. The coffin, draped in the Union flag and surmounted by his medals, rested before the altar. Reverend Ellis was absent, of course. Another clergyman from an adjoining parish officiated, reading the service with quiet competence. Lydia stood in the front pew, veiled in black lace, expression composed. Arthur stood beside her, shoulders squared, hands clasped behind his back. Miss Croft was on Lydia's other side, clutching a small posy of white chrysanthemums she had gathered herself. Miss Jane Marple sat near the back, beside her cousin Mrs. Banford. She wore her best black coat and hat, and her knitting needles were tucked discreetly in her handbag. As she listened to the familiar words, "I am the resurrection and the life," and watched the light fall through the stained glass window, painting the stone floor in muted colors. After the committal in the churchyard, where the earth was still soft from recent rain, the mourners drifted away in small groups. Lydia remained beside the grave a moment longer, then turned and walked slowly down the path. Arthur caught up with her. "I've finished the bust," he said. "The one of Uncle. It's not heroic, just a man. Lines around the eyes, a certain tightness in the mouth. I think he would have hated it, which is why I like it." Lydia stopped. "Show it to me before you leave." "I will." They walked on together toward the lich gate. Miss Marple lingered by the grave until the others had gone, and she placed a single sprig of rosemary on the new mound. "For remembrance," she murmured, then turned away. As she passed the church porch, she paused to speak to the verger, who was sweeping fallen leaves. "A sad business," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but necessary, perhaps. Some truths must come out, however painful." She walked back to her cousin's cottage along the brook path. The water ran clear and cold over smooth stones. A kingfisher flashed blue along the bank, then vanished into the reeds. That afternoon she sat in the small sitting room with her knitting and a pot of tea. Mrs. Banford brought in the tray and lingered. "You knew, didn't you?" she asked. Miss Marple smiled. "I suspected. There were so many little signs. The clasped hands, the photograph, the scar, the way the colonel reached in that last moment. Human nature is very revealing when one knows where to look." Mrs. Banford sat down. "And Ellis? Will he hang?" "That is for the courts to decide, but I think not. There are degrees of guilt and degrees of understanding. The jury may see that he acted from a wound that had never healed." Mrs. Banford sighed. "Poor man. Poor all of them." Miss Marple took up her needles again. "People cling to what was denied them," she said softly. "And sometimes that grip lasts beyond the grave." Outside, the afternoon light slanted across the valley. Sheep moved slowly over the pastures. The church bells chimed the hour. 4 slow, measured strokes. Somewhere in London, Lydia would soon begin a new life. In Bath, Miss Croft would arrange her flowers. In a London studio, Arthur would shape clay into something honest. And in a cell in Gloucester, a Theodore Ellis would wait for judgment, carrying at last the name his father had never spoken. Miss Marple looked out of the window toward the distant manor, its chimneys just visible above the trees. "Peace," she murmured, "comes in strange ways." The blackbird sang again from the apple tree, its song rising clear and untroubled into the fading light. The Cotswolds stretched golden and quiet below, hiding whatever secrets the next season might bring. But for now, the valley rested, and the house on the hill waited, empty, silent, ready for whatever story came next.